If you haven't taken a look at my longer video where I unpack and bring you up to date with everything that's going on with the SRO issue, find it on my social channels. It's well worth the 14, 15 minutes it is to get up to speed on where we're at with this issue. This is a much shorter blurb, and my point is very simple, that the intentions of the majority, the intentions of the Democrats in authoring their so-called fix to the SRO issue that they created, the problem that they created with their language that was passed into law last year, it's very clear what their motivation is, even though they're not explicitly highlighting it and bringing it out front and center. If you listen to them talk for long enough, and certainly the comments that we've heard in our committee sessions, our committee hearings, you will be able to discern what it is that they're trying to get after. And I want to share an example of that with you here from our Public Safety Committee hearing that took place on Tuesday night this week. So we're going to start with Athena Hollins, representative from the majority, a Democrat on the Public Safety Committee, and she's going to express her concern over there being consistency in how policy and expectations, the standard use of force, is implemented everywhere in the state. Now, that's an interesting concern to even raise, given the fact that prior to this language becoming law, there was consistency, right? The same standard that applied to SROs was the standard that applied to any given law enforcement officer in any situation, scenario, or context, the reasonable use of force standard. And so by passing a law that creates a second standard specifically for school resource officers, you are by definition creating an unreasonable standard that they are going to have to live by. So what's interesting there is, if it were true, and I want you to really pay attention to this, if it were true that this bill, authored by Cedric Frazier, is a fix to the problem they created last year, why would there be any concern about consistency in standards and implementation? That's what you had prior to the language that was passed last year. The only reason to be concerned about consistency in the application of standards is if you're anticipating that there's going to be a different standard for SROs. And indeed, that is the very purpose for which this law has been authored. The key provision is the model policy that's going to be put together by the post board, the licensing board for police officers, and then imposed under threat of license sanction, meaning you could have your license to be a law enforcement officer potentially revoked if you don't abide by this, whatever standards the post board comes up with. And clearly the anticipation from the majority is that what those standards are going to be something different than the status quo, something different than what applies to every other law enforcement officer, because if it wasn't going to be different, then they wouldn't be so deeply concerned about making sure that it's applied consistently in every district in the state. Check this out.
It is correct, or at least it is my understanding, that there is not uniformity across the state with how the law that we passed in 2023 would be interpreted. Is that correct?
Representative Frazier.
That is correct. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Hollins.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm in St. Paul. I represent St. Paul. I live in St. Paul. My kids are in St. Paul. There are no SROs in St. Paul Public Schools. You are in Hennepin County, where the Hennepin County attorney has said that she interprets the law one way, and you have a clear understanding of that. But what guarantee is there that we know what and how children will be treated in, say, Representative Tabke's district or Representative Curran's district? Do we have any guarantee on how those children will be treated and how SROs will be working with those children?
Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Hollins, for those questions. We do not. I mean, that's the importance of the model policy piece and also the other pieces in the current proposal that we have in front of us that will create the uniformity, comprehensive uniformity around the state. And I've talked to folks about this ad nauseum now, is that, if we stay with the status quo, we still have some of this uncertainty. And I think that's, for most part, and what I hear from community folks, they don't want that uncertainty. Law enforcement doesn't want that uncertainty. Education folks don't want that uncertainty. Our youth do not want that uncertainty. That is what this bill will do, will push us toward a uniform process throughout the state and remove that uncertainty.
So if you read between the lines of what Representative Frazier is saying, he's saying that the quote unquote stakeholder groups that he's been talking to, who are the only people who they allow in the room, by the way, like I'm not a stakeholder by their standard, and neither are any of the 40,000 people I represent. But the folks who they're talking to are telling them that they also want consistency. And that's a great choice of words from a political standpoint, but it's also undefined, which is what gives it such utility, right? Consistency toward what? Consistency of what? That's the question. What do you want to be consistent? Because again, under the old standard, prior to this language even causing the problem in the first place, we had a consistent standard. It was the reasonable use of force standard. So the only reason to be concerned about consistency going forward is if you don't intend to return to that. If the intention of this law is to indeed create, through other means, a second standard for SROs that is different than reasonable use of force. That's the goal of the Democrats, and that's why we're voting no and opposing this with everything we've got. So I'm going to do something potentially unconventional, and I'm actually going to stick up for Representative Frazier and try to reassure you, if you came here tonight, or if you're watching, or you wrote a piece of testimony concerned about what this bill achieves and what it accomplishes, and you're afraid that we're taking away the ability to impose activist expectations upon law enforcement. That is not what this bill does. What this bill does is it takes the language out of statute that provides double restraint or two different standards for use of force for law enforcement, takes it out of the hands of this body and the legislature, and it puts it in the purview of the post board, who gets to make what Representative Frazier just referred to as model policy, and which was pointed out by Representative Whitty, is enforced under sanction, potential loss of licensure, and what have you. So what we're having here is a situation where, indeed, if you think that there's a separate standard that ought to be imposed in our public schools, you're going to get your opportunity. It just won't be here in a public forum as part of the legislative process. All you're going to have to do is influence your activist friends who have been appointed by the governor to the post board, and they'll be able to make up any rule they want and impose it under force of potentially losing licenses. So you should applaud Representative Frazier for accomplishing exactly what you want through means that don't involve the consent of the governed. Thank you.